The Galactic Concorde had watched the stars for 10,000 years, and in all that time, they had never found anything that truly scared them until they found Earth. The survey ship Endless Horizon dropped out of hyperspace near the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star, and the crew expected nothing special because they had cataloged thousands of primitive worlds before this one, and they assumed this would be no different. Commander Thalvex stood on the observation deck and watched the blue and green planet spin slowly beneath them, and he thought it was actually quite beautiful in its own simple way, and he wondered what kind of creatures lived down there, in those vast oceans and sprawling forests. The first scans came back within an hour, and the science officer nearly dropped her datapad when she read the results, because the dominant species was not only sentient, but they had already developed nuclear technology and primitive space travel, and they called themselves humans. Thalvex was pleased at first, because finding a species on the edge of interstellar capability was rare and valuable, and the Concorde always welcomed new members into their galactic community, and he imagined the ceremonies and the treaties and the cultural exchanges that would follow. But then the deeper scans came back and everything changed. The chief geneticist was a Veldari named Cross, and she had studied alien biology for 300 years, and she had never seen anything like human DNA before, and when she called the commander to her laboratory, her hands were shaking and her voice was barely a whisper. She showed him the data on the main screen and explained that every sentient species in the known galaxy had stable genetic code that remained essentially unchanged from generation to generation, and this stability was considered the foundation of civilized life, because it made species predictable and manageable, and safe. Human DNA was not stable. Cross pulled up comparison charts and showed him how human genetic code contained vast sections of what she called dormant potential, and these sections could activate in response to environmental stress, and when they activated, the human body would physically change and adapt in ways that should have been impossible. Thalvex did not understand at first, so Cross showed him the footage from the observation drones they had sent into Earth's atmosphere, and he watched a human survive a fall that should have killed him, and he watched another human develop resistance to a toxin within a single generation, and he watched children born near radiation zones who did not die, but instead grew stronger. The commander asked if this was evolution, and Cross said it was something far more dangerous, because normal evolution took thousands of years, but humans could change within a single lifetime, and sometimes within a single moment of extreme stress. She called it adaptive mutation, and she said it was the most sophisticated and terrifying survival mechanism she had ever encountered. The Concorde High Council received the report within a week, and the debate that followed lasted for 3 months, and some council members argued that humanity should be welcomed and studied and uplifted like any other promising species, but others warned that allowing such an unstable genome to spread across the galaxy would be catastrophic. In the end, Fear One Earth was classified as a quarantine world, and no contact was permitted, and automated defense platforms were placed in orbit to prevent any human ships from leaving their solar system, and the official reason given was that humanity was too primitive for integration. But everyone who read the classified reports knew the truth. The Concorde was afraid of what humans might become, but the quarantine came too late. A colony ship called the New Dawn had launched from Earth 3 years before the Concorde arrived, and it carried 10,000 human settlers toward a distant star, and no one in the galaxy knew it existed until it emerged from hyperspace near a Concorde trading post, and by then it was far too late to stop what had already begun. The colonists had spent 2 years in hyperspace, and the strange energies of that dimension had affected them in ways no one could have predicted, and when they stumbled out of their ship, they were not quite the same humans who had left Earth. Some of them could see in spectrums that no organic eye should perceive, and others had developed bone density that made them nearly invulnerable to physical trauma, and a few could sense electromagnetic fields with their bare skin, and one young woman had discovered she could hold her breath for nearly an hour without any discomfort. The trading post officials did not know what to do with these strange visitors, and they called for guidance from the High Council, but before any response came, the colonists had already disappeared into the vast network of stations and settlements that made up the galactic frontier. They scattered like seeds in the wind, and they found work where they could, and they had children who inherited their parents' changes and sometimes developed new abilities of their own. And within a generation, there were humans on 100 different worlds, and the Concord had no way to track them all. The official policy was still quarantine and non-contact, but the reality was that humanity had already escaped, and they were changing faster than anyone could measure, and they were learning to hide their differences and blend in with the other species around them. 20 years passed, and the galaxy tried to forget about the human problem because there were other concerns like trade disputes and territorial negotiations, and the occasional border skirmish, and the scattered human population seemed content to live quietly in the margins of civilized space. Then the Velkari Empire declared war. The Velkari were an ancient species who had rejected the Concord's offer of membership centuries ago, and they had been building their military strength in the outer regions, and when they finally attacked, they came with a fleet of 10,000 biomechanical warships that tore through the Concord's defenses like they were made of paper. System after system fell, and millions died. And these Concord's admirals realized with growing horror that their predictable tactics were useless against an enemy that a full Nivage seemed to anticipate every move they made. The War Council met in emergency session, and they discussed options, and none of them were good. And then someone suggested something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. They suggested hiring humans. The council members looked at each other with fear and uncertainty because they remembered the reports about adaptive mutation and genetic instability. And they knew that bringing humans into the war would be like releasing a virus into their own civilization. But they were losing, and desperate people do desperate things. The first recruitment notices went out to the frontier stations where humans were known to live, and the pay offered was enormous, and the missions were described only as high risk with no further details. The council expected a handful of volunteers at most. They received thousands of applications within the first week, and every single applicant was a mutant. Captain Myra Vance stood in the cargo bay of her ship and watched the newest batch of recruits file through the airlock, and she studied each face carefully because she had learned long ago that you could tell a lot about a mutant by the way they carried themselves. The ship was called the Penumbra, and it was an old freighter that Vance had bought with her military severance pay and modified over the years until it barely resembled its original design, and now it served as home to the most unusual crew in the galaxy. Vance herself looked almost normal at first glance, with her dark hair cut short and her brown eyes that seemed to miss nothing, but if you looked closer, you would notice that her pupils sometimes dilated in ways that made no sense, and that was because she could see heat signatures as clearly as visible light, and this ability had saved her life more times than she could count. Her first officer was a massive man named Decker, who stood nearly 7 feet tall and weighed over 300 pounds, and almost all of that weight was muscle and bone that had grown so dense that standard medical scanners could not penetrate his body, and he had once walked through a plasma fire without any protection and emerged with nothing but mild sunburn. The ship's navigator was a small Japanese woman named Yuki, who rarely spoke but whose eyes were constantly moving as if tracking things that no one else could see. And that was because she could perceive the entire electromagnetic spectrum from radio waves to gamma radiation, and she could spot an enemy ship's power signature from halfway across a solar system. The medic was known only as Brother Ash because he had been a monk before his mutation manifested, And he had chosen to keep his religious name even after leaving his monastery, and his ability was both a gift and a curse because he could regenerate from almost any injury. But each time he died and came back, he lost a piece of his memory, and after 17 deaths, he could no longer remember his childhood or his family or even his real name. The newest member of the crew was a teenager named Cole, who had grown up on a space station near the Galactic Rim, and his mutation allowed him to interface directly with computer systems through physical touch. And the Concord military had tried to recruit him for their intelligence division, but he had chosen the Penumbra instead because he did not trust the people who had kept his species quarantined for 2 decades. These were the people the Concord called monsters and freaks and genetic aberrations, and these were the people who were now expected to save the galaxy from the Valkyrie Empire. The first mission briefing came through encrypted channels, and Vance gathered her crew in the common room to review the details. And when she finished reading the orders aloud, there was a long silence before Decker let out a low whistle. The target was a Valkyrie staging ground on a moon called Threshka, and intelligence suggested that 3 battle fleets were gathering there before launching an assault on the Concord's core worlds, and the mission was simple in theory, but impossible in practice because the moon was surrounded by defense platforms and patrol ships and ground forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Concord wired the Penumbra crew to infiltrate the staging ground and destroy the command center and eliminate the fleet admirals and escape without being detected, and they wanted all of this done within 72 hours. Yuki asked what support they would receive, and Vance said none because the Concord could not risk being connected to the operation, and if they were captured or killed, they would be disavowed and forgotten. Cole asked why they should risk their lives for people who hated them, and Vance said because those same people were sheltering human refugees on a dozen different stations, and if the Valkyrie won the war, those refugees would be the first to die. Brother Ash simply nodded and began preparing his medical kit because he knew he would probably die at least once during this mission, and he wanted to make sure he had everything he needed for the aftermath. They reached Threshka 3 days later, and Vance brought the Penumbra in low through an asteroid field that would have torn any other ship apart, but Yuki could see every rock and debris fragment before they came close, and she guided them through with millimeter precision. The defense platforms never detected them because their sensors were calibrated for normal ships, with normal crew making normal decisions, and the Penumbra did nothing normal. They landed in a canyon 2 kilometers from the main base and waited for nightfall, even though the concept of night on an airless moon was somewhat arbitrary, and then they moved out in pairs with Vance and Decker taking point while Yuki and Cole followed at a distance and Brother Ash brought up the rear. The first patrol they encountered was a squad of 6 Valkyrie soldiers in full combat armor, and Decker handled them alone while the others watched because his dense bones and muscles made him virtually immune to their energy weapons, and he moved through them like a boulder rolling through tall grass. Cole accessed the base's security network through a terminal they found on one of the bodies, and within minutes he had mapped every patrol route and camera position and alarm system, and he uploaded the data to the rest of the team through their neural implants. They reached the command center without firing another shot because Yuki could see the guards before they came around corners, and Vance could track their body heat through walls, and Cole could disable security systems with a touch, and they moved like ghosts through a facility that was supposed to be impenetrable. The 3 fleet admirals were meeting in a sealed conference room when Decker kicked down the door, and what followed took less than 30 seconds, and Vance did not allow herself to think about it afterward because some memories were better left unexamined. The escape was harder because alarms were finally sounding and thousands of Valkyrie soldiers were converging on their position, and Brother Ash volunteered to create a diversion, and Vance wanted to argue, but she knew there was no other way. He walked out into the open and let them shoot him and when he fell, they assumed he was dead and moved past his body toward the others. And then he got up and killed the soldiers from behind. And they shot him again, and he fell again, and he got up again, and by the time he stopped getting up, the rest of the crew was already aboard the Penumbra, and lifting off they found him 3 hours later, crawling through the asteroid field, with half his body missing, and Vance brought him aboard, and Yuki held his hand while his flesh slowly regrew, and when he finally opened his eyes he looked at them with confusion and asked who they were. It took 2 days for his memories to return this time, and some of them never came back at all. The Concorde declared the mission a success and transferred the payment to Vance's account, as she distributed shares to her crew, and none of them celebrated because there was nothing to celebrate. They had won, but the cost was always high, and the galaxy still saw them as monsters, and the war was just beginning. Word began to spread through the Valkyrie ranks about what had happened on Threshka, and soldiers whispered to each other in the dark spaces between battles, and they spoke of enemies who could see through walls and walk through fire and rise from the dead, and they gave these enemies a name that would echo through the Empire for years to come. Mutants skulk in the shadows, they said, and no one is safe. General Kethra stood before the Supreme Command and felt the weight of their judgment pressing down upon her like a physical force, and she had served the Volcari Empire for 60 years, and she had never known fear until the humans came. The chamber was vast and dark and filled with the chittering sounds of the 12 high commanders who ruled the Empire, and their biomechanical bodies gleamed in the dim light, and their compound eyes tracked her every movement, and she knew that one wrong word could end her career and possibly her life. She had come to deliver a report that none of them wanted to hear: the war against the Cheer. Concorde was supposed to be simple, because the Valkyrie had spent centuries preparing, and their fleets were unstoppable, and their soldiers were fearless, and their commanders were brilliant, and yet somehow they were losing. 3 staging grounds had been destroyed in the past month, and 17 fleet admirals had been assassinated, and supply lines were being disrupted across the entire front, and the Valkyrie Intelligence Division had no idea how any of this was happening. Until now, Kethra activated the holographic display and showed them footage recovered from Threshka, and the High Commanders watched in silence as a massive human walked through plasma fire without flinching, and as another human regrew half his body in a matter of hours, and his enemies appeared and disappeared like spirits in the night. She explained what her analysts had discovered about human genetic instability, and she showed them the comparison charts between human DNA and every other known species, and she told them what she believed was the terrible truth at the heart of this war. The humans were not a static enemy, and they were not like the Concorde races who could be studied and predicted and countered, and they were something new and dangerous, and the longer the war continued, the stronger they would become. One of the high commanders asked how this was possible, and Kethra explained that human DNA contained vast reservoirs of dormant potential that could activate in response to stress, and that the stress of war and combat and survival in hostile environments was triggering mutations across the entire human population. Every weapon the Valkyrie used against them was teaching them how to become immune to that weapon, and every tactic they employed was training the humans to counter that tactic, and every battle they won was creating survivors who would pass their adaptations on to the next generation. The Supreme Command deliberated for 3 hours, while Kethra waited outside the chamber, and when they finally summoned her back, they had made their decision. She was given command of a new division called the Purification Corps, and her mission was to eliminate the human threat by any means necessary, and she was authorized to use weapons and tactics that had been forbidden for centuries, and the only constraint was that she had to succeed. Kethra accepted the assignment and began planning immediately, because she understood something that the High Commanders did not, and she knew that conventional warfare would never work against an enemy that evolved in response to conflict. She needed a different approach. Her agents captured a human 3 weeks later on a remote mining station near the Galactic Rim, and his name was Cole, and he was young and frightened, and his ability to interface with technology made him incredibly valuable to the Concord War effort. The biosculptors took him apart piece by piece, and they documented every cell and every gene and every protein chain, and they mapped his nervous system and his muscle tissue and his bone structure. And when they were finished, they put him back together and started again. Cole screamed for the first week, and then he stopped screaming and started talking because the pain became too much, and he told them everything he knew about the Penumbra and its crew and the Concord's plans and the location of human refugee stations. Kethra listened to the recordings and studied the data, and slowly a picture began to form in her mind of how human mutation actually worked, and she realized that she had been thinking about the problem all wrong. The humans were not random, and their changes were not chaotic, and there was a pattern beneath the surface that connected everything, and that pattern was survival. Human DNA read the environment like a language and translated threats into biological responses, and this meant that the more the Valkyrie threatened them, the faster they would adapt and the stronger they would become, and there was only one way to break this cycle: stop threatening them directly. Kethra ordered her fleets to pull back from the front lines, and the high commanders questioned her decision, but she had been given full authority, and she used it without hesitation, and within a month the Valkyrie had retreated to defensive positions across the entire theater of war. The Concord celebrated what they thought was a victory, and the human mercenaries were confused by this sudden change, and Captain Vance suspected a trap, but she could not figure out what kind of trap required the enemy to stop fighting. Then the attacks began. Valkyrie strike teams hit refugee stations across the frontier, and they did not engage military targets or Concord installations, and they focused exclusively on human civilians. And the strikes were fast and brutal, and they left no survivors. Sanctuary Station was the largest human settlement outside Earth, and it held nearly 3,000 refugees, including children and elderly and families who had fled the quarantine zone to find a better life, and Kethra chose it as her primary target because she knew the mutant mercenaries would come to defend it. She positioned 40 warships in a blockade around the station, and she waited because she wanted the Penumbra to come, and she wanted Vance and her crew to see what was about to happen, and she wanted them to understand that they could not protect everyone. The message reached Vance 2 days later, and she gathered her crew and showed them the tactical data. And everyone could see that the situation was hopeless, because 40 warships against one modified freighter was not a battle, it was an execution. Cole was gone, and they all knew what had probably happened to him, and Brother Ash had lost so many memories that he sometimes forgot where he was, and Decker's body was covered in scars from wounds that should have been fatal, and Yuki had not slept in weeks because she could not stop seeing the electromagnetic echoes of dead soldiers. They were tired and broken and outnumbered, and they had every reason to stay away from Sanctuary Station and let the Valkyrie do whatever they planned to do. Vance asked if anyone wanted to stay behind, and no one moved and no one spoke, and after a moment, she nodded and set course for the station. The Penumbra jumped into hyperspace, and Vance stood alone on the bridge and watched the strange energies swirl around the ship, and she thought about all the humans who had passed through this dimension before her, and all the changes that had been triggered by this journey. She wondered what she would become before this was over. She wondered if she would survive long enough to find out. The Penumbra dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sanctuary system, and Yuki immediately began scanning the blockade, and her enhanced eyes flickered through spectrum after spectrum as she built a complete picture of what they were facing. 40 warships arranged in a perfect sphere around the station, and each ship bristling with weapons that could reduce the Penumbra to atoms in seconds, and fighter patrols sweeping the perimeter in overlapping patterns that left no gaps, and it was exactly the kind of trap that Kethra wanted them to see. Vance studied the tactical display, and her heat vision showed her the power signatures of each ship, and she could tell which ones were running their weapons hot and which ones were conserving energy. And she noticed something interesting about the flagship at the center of the formation. The flagship was the only ship not actively targeting the station, and its weapons were pointed outward, and its shields were at maximum, and whoever was in command of this operation was more worried about threats from outside the blockade than threats from within. That meant Kethra was on the flagship, and that meant she was waiting for them. Vance called her crew to the bridge and laid out a plan that was less a plan and more a series of desperate gambles strung together with hope, and she asked each of them if they understood their role, and each of them nodded. Decker would take a shuttle and fly directly at the flagship because he was the only one who could survive a direct assault, and his job was to cause chaos and draw attention away from the others. Yuki would guide the Penumbra through the patrol patterns, using her enhanced perception to find the gaps that normal sensors could not detect, and she would bring the ship as close to the station as possible before anyone noticed. Brother Ash would board the station through an emergency airlock and make his way to the civilian shelters and protect the refugees with his body, if necessary. And Vance did not say what everyone was thinking, which was that he might die so many times that there would be nothing left of him when this was over. Vance herself would coordinate the assault from the Penumbra, and she had one more card to play, but she was not ready to reveal it yet. They launched Decker's shuttle first and watched it streak toward the flagship, and the Valkyrie responded exactly as Vance had predicted, with fighters breaking formation to intercept and weapons batteries tracking the small craft. Decker's voice came over the comm, and he was laughing because he had always loved the feeling of flying into impossible odds, and he said something about seeing them on the other side. And then his shuttle slammed into the flagship's docking bay, and the connection went silent. The explosion that followed was visible from across the system, and Vance felt her heart stop for a moment before she reminded herself that Decker had survived worse, and he would survive this. Yuki brought the Penumbra in through a gap in the patrol pattern that lasted exactly 4 seconds, and they slipped past 3 destroyers without being detected and reached the station's maintenance dock just as alarms began sounding across the blockade. Brother Ash was already moving before the ship finished docking, and he ran through the corridors toward the civilian shelters, and Valkyrie boarding parties were entering from multiple points, and he knew he could not stop them all, but he could slow them down. The first squad he encountered shot him 17 times, and he fell, and they stepped over his body and continued toward the shelters, and then he got up and killed them from behind and took their weapons and moved on. The second squad was more careful, and they made sure he was dead before moving on, and they were wrong, and he got up again and kept fighting. Third squad tried to burn his body with plasma grenades, and it took him 20 minutes to regenerate from that, and when he finally stood up, he could not remember why he was fighting or who he was trying to protect, but he saw Valkyrie soldiers, and he saw human civilians, and something deep inside him knew which side he was on. Back on the flagship, Decker was carving a path through the corridors toward the command center, and his dense bones turned aside energy weapons, and his massive fists crushed armor plating, and soldiers who tried to stop him simply bounced off and lay still. He found the command center sealed behind blast doors 3 meters thick, and he put his shoulder against them and pushed, and the metal groaned and bent and finally gave way, and he stepped through into a room full of tactical displays and frightened officers and one calm general who watched him approach without any sign of fear. Kethra looked at Decker and said she had been expecting someone like him, and she asked if he thought one mutant could really defeat an entire empire. Decker smiled and said he was not trying to defeat the empire, and he was just trying to buy time. Kira asked time for what, answer came from the flagship's communication system, which suddenly broadcast a message to every ship in the blockade, and the message contained data that Cole had transmitted before his death, and the data showed every documented case of human adaptive mutation from the past 20 years. The Volcari soldiers saw humans breathing toxic atmosphere without any protection, and humans surviving in hard vacuum for hours, and humans regenerating from wounds that should have been instantly fatal, and humans developing new abilities in response to new threats. They saw footage of Decker walking through plasma fire and Brother Ash rising from the dead, and Yuki tracking enemies through solid walls, and they saw things that should have been impossible over and over again. Message ended with a simple question that Vance had recorded before the assault. How do you fight an enemy that gets stronger every time you try to kill them? The answer was you cannot. The blockade began to fragment as ships broke formation and fled toward open space, and captains decided that their own survival was more important than following orders, and soldiers who had been willing to die for the Empire suddenly realized that dying would accomplish nothing. Kithra watched her fleet scatter, and she understood that she had lost, not because she was outfought, but because she was outhought, and the humans had used her own trap against her. She looked at Decker and asked what would happen now. Decker said she should probably run while she still could. Kithra considered her options and decided that living to fight another day was better than dying here. And she activated an escape pod and ejected from the flagship, and Decker let her go because killing one general would not end the war. The blockade collapsed completely within an hour, and the penumbra docked with the station, and Vance ran through the corridors until she found Brother Ash sitting against a wall covered in blood that was mostly his own. She asked if he was all right, and he looked up at her with eyes that held no recognition and asked who she was. Yuki found them there a few minutes later, and she sat down next to Brother Ash and held his hand and waited for his memories to return, and Vance went to check on the refugees and found 3,000 people who were scared but alive. They had won. The cost was still being counted. The war ended not with a grand treaty signing or a formal surrender, but with silence, as the Volcari simply stopped fighting and pulled their fleets back to their home systems and sealed their borders against all contact. The Galactic Concord declared victory and held celebrations across 1,000 worlds, and politicians gave speeches about courage and sacrifice and the triumph of civilization over barbarism, and none of them mentioned the mutants who had actually won the war. Vance watched one of these speeches from a bar on the frontier, and she laughed bitterly and ordered another drink, and the bartender, who was a four-armed Dashan, asked if she was all right, and she said she was fine, and she was lying. 6 months had passed since the Battle of Sanctuary Station, and the Penumbra had been decommissioned because the Concord no longer needed human mercenaries, and the crew had scattered to find whatever lives they could build in a galaxy that still feared them. Decker had taken a job as a cargo hauler on a mining station where no one asked questions about his past or his abilities, and he sent messages to Vance every few weeks, and they were always short and practical, and she could tell he was lonely but too proud to admit it. Yuki had returned to Earth, which was no longer under quarantine because the Concord had finally accepted humanity into their ranks, and she was working with scientists who wanted to understand her enhanced perception, and she seemed happy in her messages, but Vance knew her well enough to see the sadness underneath. Brother Ash was the hardest one to track because his memories had never fully returned after Sanctuary Station, and he had wandered off one day and no one had seen him since, and Vance had hired investigators to find him, but they always came back with nothing. Cole was dead, and Vance kept a picture of him in her quarters because she did not want to forget what he had looked like, and she blamed herself for his death, even though she knew there was nothing she could have done to save him. The Concord had invited Vance to attend a ceremony where she would receive a medal for her service, but she had declined because she did not want to stand on a stage and smile while politicians pretended to honor her, and she especially did not want to hear them talk about the war like it was something glorious. War was not glorious, and Vance knew this better than most because she had seen what it cost. And she had watched friends die and come back wrong, and she had made decisions that still kept her awake at night. She finished her drink and paid her tab and walked out into the station's artificial sunlight, and she thought about what she was going to do with the rest of her life, and she had no answers. The message arrived 3 days later from a source she did not recognize, and it contained coordinates for a meeting on a neutral station near the galactic rim, and there was no signature or explanation, just a request for her presence. Vance knew it could be a trap, but she also knew that staying safe had never been her style, and she booked passage on a transport ship and arrived at the coordinates 2 weeks later. The station was small and old and populated mostly by traders and refugees and other people who had reasons to avoid attention, and Vance fit right in, and she found the meeting location easily enough. It was a memorial garden that someone had built in the station's central hub, and it was full of plants from a dozen different worlds, and there were benches scattered throughout, and Vance sat down and waited. The Concord ambassador arrived 10 minutes later, and he was a tall Veldari named Cross, who Vance recognized from intelligence briefings, and she tensed because she did not know why a high-ranking diplomat would want to meet with her in secret. Cross sat down across from her and said that he had a proposition, and he wanted her to listen before she made any decisions. He explained that the Concord had finally realized that humanity was not going away and that trying to contain or control human mutation was pointless and dangerous, and the only option was integration. But integration required trust, and trust required understanding, and understanding required people who could serve as bridges between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. He was offering Vance a position as a special envoy, and her job would be to help human communities throughout the galaxy navigate their relationships with alien governments, and to serve as an advocate for mutant rights, and to ensure that what happened during the war never happened again. Vance asked why she should trust the Concord after everything they had done, and Cross said she should not trust the Concord, and she should only trust herself and her own judgment about what was right. He said the galaxy was changing, and humanity was part of that change now, whether anyone liked it or not, and someone needed to make sure that change did not lead to more war and more death. Vance thought about it for a long time, and she thought about Cole and Brother Ash and Decker and Yuki and all the other mutants who had given everything for a galaxy that despised them, and she thought about the 3,000 refugees on Sanctuary Station who were alive because of what her crew had done. She said yes. The next 5 years were the hardest of her life, and she traveled to hundreds of worlds and met thousands of people, and she argued and negotiated and sometimes threatened, and slowly she began to build something that had never existed before. A community of mutants who were not hiding anymore, and who were not ashamed of what they were, and who were learning to use their abilities openly and proudly. Some of them became scientists and doctors, and they used their enhanced perceptions and abilities to make discoveries that changed the course of medicine and physics and biology. Some of them became artists and writers, and they created works that explored what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of aliens, and their art was strange and beautiful, and it spoke to something deep inside everyone who experienced it. Some of them became protectors, and they used their abilities to defend the innocent and fight injustice, and they became heroes to a new generation of children who grew up believing that being different was not something to fear. Vance found Brother Ash on a remote moon where he had been living as a hermit for 3 years, and his memories were still fragmented, but he remembered her, and he remembered the penumbra, and he cried when she told him what had happened since he left. She brought him back to Sanctuary Station, where they had built a memorial for everyone who had died during the war, and Cole's name was on the wall along with hundreds of others, and Vance visited it every time. She came to the station. She stood there one evening as the station's artificial sun was setting, and she thought about all the humans who had changed, and all the humans who had died, and all the humans who were still changing out there in the galaxy. The Concord had called them monsters once, and they had feared what lurked in the shadows, and they had tried to quarantine and contain and control something that could not be controlled. They had been wrong. What lurked in the shadows was not monsters, but people, and people who had suffered and adapted and survived, and people who had refused to stop being human, even when their bodies changed in impossible ways. The galaxy had learned to fear the mutants, and that fear had nearly destroyed everything. And now the galaxy was learning something different. And it was learning that the shadows were not something to fear, but something to understand. Vance touched Cole's name on the memorial wall and whispered a promise that she would keep fighting for as long as she could, and then she turned and walked away into the artificial sunset. Behind her, the memorial stood silent and permanent, and it would stand for 1,000 years as a reminder of what humanity had sacrificed and what humanity had gained. The mutants no longer skulked in the shadows. They had stepped into the light, and the light had made room for them, and the galaxy would never be the same.